Hey everyone, this is your host, Andrew Holland. Thank you so much for listening to the Andrew Holland podcast each and every week, where we talk about business, entrepreneurship, and everything in between. As an entrepreneur who's been through a lot of highs and a lot of lows, I started this podcast to be a source of weekly motivation, inspiration, and support for all of us who are working to achieve something meaningful. And as importantly, so that none of us ever have to feel alone or isolated while we're doing so. Together, we explore the stories of successful people, we get insight and advice from individuals who have accomplished amazing things. We discuss practical and fascinating business models and strategies, and we dive deep into understanding ourselves as human beings. So please, help me grow our group and subscribe to the show on your favorite audio platform. Subscribe to, watch, and thumbs up our episodes on our YouTube channel, the Andrew Holland Podcast. Follow and interact with me on Twitter and Threads. My handle is A Holland Podcast. That's A Holland Podcast. That's probably my favorite part of the whole podcast is the interaction I get with our guests and with you as our listeners. Lastly, if you enjoy the show and you want to support what we're working to accomplish, please share our show with your friends, with your family, and your colleagues at work. This show is nothing without you and your support, and I'm so incredibly thankful for each and every one of you listening, watching, and sharing the podcast every single week. Now it's time to get our motivation, inspiration, and support for this week and jump into today's episode. In today's episode, I share part one of my conversation with Akshay Nanavati, the founder of Fearvana and a former Marine who embraces this concept of mirroring fear with nirvana. And as opposed to being afraid of your quote-unquote negative emotions like fear, he talks about embracing adversity and struggle in order to experience true happiness and fulfillment. Akshay shares his life journey with us from being a child and having a troubled youth and getting addicted to drugs where two of his friends ended up dying, to ultimately watching a movie, Black Hawk Down, that completely changed his life and helped him find purpose, where he ultimately ended up joining the Marines, fought in Iraq, and then came back and was diagnosed with PTSD. And he has a really interesting take on this concept of PTSD, and he utilized that down point in his life to start the upward trek. To this point, he's gone all across the world, experienced so many invigorating outside journeys, whether it's running across Liberia, hiking Mount Kilimanjaro, hiking the Himalayas, to now he joined us remotely from Alaska, where he's training for his next big expedition, hiking solo over 110 days, over 1,700 miles across Antarctica, which he is currently training for and plans on beginning in November of 2024. I really enjoyed this first part of the conversation with Akshay and hearing his journey and how he got to where he is today. And I think you'll get a lot of meaning out of his mindset in this concept of Fearvana.
While Andrew Holland is a CPA, a real estate broker, and involved in multiple businesses, including some investment companies, the Andrew Holland podcast is for informational purposes only. All of Andrew's views and those of his guests are solely their opinions and do not reflect the opinions of any of the businesses or companies Andrew or his guests are affiliated with. You should not treat any advice, conversation, business recommendation, investment recommendation, or anything of the like as a specific inducement to make a specific business decision, take a specific action, make a particular investment, or follow a specific business or investment strategy. Thank you so much for listening and enjoy the show.
Akshay, thank you so much for joining us on the Andrew Holland podcast, and welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, brother. Good to be here.
So you have an incredible story. There's so much for us to talk about, whether it's 10 days in silence that you've been in, Himalayas, Kilimanjaro, the current endeavor that you're doing, which is getting ready to trek across Antarctica, 1,700 miles by yourself. You'd break 3 different records. But before we get into all of that, you're obviously the founder of Fearvana, and you wrote the book about Fearvana and basically the revolutionary idea of using fear to your advantage. Mm-hmm. But you have a story from childhood, moving into getting older, being in the Marines. You said Black Hawk Down really changed your whole
Hmm.
life and
Hmm.
ultimately is what made you go into the Marines. Take us back. Were you born? What type of childhood did you have? Give us a little background before we
Yeah.
start talking about all the incredible adventures that you've done.
Sure. Yeah, I was born in India, born in Bombay, India, moved from Bombay to then Bangalore to Singapore to Austin, Texas. So by the time I was 13, I moved to four different cities, three different countries, and blessed with a good life. I mean, my parents weren't incredibly wealthy at the time. They were middle class, but certainly no suffering, right? Great parents who loved me, put me in good schools, really didn't know struggle, any suffering really. Just the moving, kept me the moving around that much as a little kid. It kept me sort of lost and adaptable because every time we moved, I was always looking to adapt to new worlds, and as a result, made friends easily. But the sort of shadow side of that strength is you're very impressionable. So when I moved to Austin, Texas, soon after moving here, I got very heavily into drugs, into alcohol, lost two friends to addiction, and I don't blame my friends. I take responsibility for my behavior, but as a young child, you're impressionable. So I got into a group of friends and I was the one to kind of push that line because I was the same version of me, but drugs was my vehicle of expression. So I was doing the harder stuff, really going hard, right? And would have led the same way as my friends until, as you mentioned, the movie, watching that movie Black Hawk Down. I saw that in high school and that planted the seed that changed my life forever.
What did your parents do for a living?
So my dad worked for 3M for 27 years, so that's why we moved around a lot. He
Okay.
moved with his job. He actually started 3M, or was one of the first people to start 3M in India, and then moved from 3M India to 3M Singapore to 3M in the U.S.
And that's what ultimately brought you to Austin, Texas.
That's what brought us here. Yep,
And you were about, you said 13 at the time?
13 when I moved here, and then I got heavily into the drugs and everything at around 15 or 16.
And tell us about, were you put into the public school system at that point and then you just got in the wrong crowd, or give us some insight as to kind of how that became your path at that point in your life?
Yeah, yeah. I went into the public school system, and my parents have asked now because now they know the extent of how deep I was. At the time, I obviously lied a ton. I got caught. Not only was I an idiot, but I got caught doing everything as well. And so, but I always kind of lied and didn't say as much as I was doing. But now they know the truth because it's not who I am anymore. But they
Yeah.
asked me, what could we have done differently? And the thing is, they didn't know. We all don't know what we don't know. So like the things that I do now, for example, had I gotten into outdoor sports, for example, because I have a lot of energy that needs to be, I kind of joke with my wife now that I'm a sled puppy, like a sled dog. I
Yeah.
got that energy that needs to be expunged and need puts to use. So had I gotten into outdoor sports, I probably wouldn't have gone down that road. But they didn't know these things that I now do are even things that people do. We grew up in big cities our whole life. I didn't see snow till I was 14, so I didn't know these things were things one does. So I did get into a group of friends, and they, and again, not to blame them. I just like I'm a young impressionable child, and so they got into drinking and drugs, and I wanted to kind of like I was even known to be the crazy one. So I even have these scars on my arm from cutting myself, burning myself here. Like I would be the one pushing the line, and Akshay was that crazy guy. Which to
Yeah.
some degree I am still, but now it's in a more positive way. It's seeking spiritual growth as opposed to doing it with just no virtue or value to the pain that I was putting myself in at the time.
Yeah, you certainly found a much healthier outlet. And so
Mm.
tell us about that. You are watching Black Hawk Down
Yeah,
just by happen chance. And what did that do for you? How did that take you out of that life of
yeah.
drugs that you just described?
So actually, that night I still remember we were supposed to do another night of drinking and drugs, and one friend wanted to go watch the movie. Nobody would go, and I was like, "All right, I'll go with you," since nobody else was going. And we saw it. And have you seen the movie?
I have.
Yeah,
Yeah.
specifically, there was that scene. Then you may remember where Gary, because it's a movie based on a true story, and
Yep.
Gary Gordon and Randy Sugar, these two Delta snipers, they were in a chopper, relatively safe, and they volunteered to go onto the ground to set up a defensive perimeter to protect the second Black Hawk that crashed. Michael Durant was in that chopper, and they didn't have any idea when reinforcements would arrive because all the reinforcements were being held down by enemy fire. They knew that hundreds, if not thousands, of armed enemy personnel were coming their way, and they still volunteered to go down. Both of them died, but the guy they died protecting, Michael Durant, is still alive because of what they did. They received the Medal of Honor posthumously for their courage and their valor. And that specifically, that scene specifically, it was, it's awe inspiring. The courage to do that, to put yourself voluntary in the line of fire, to give your life up for somebody else, and it left a mark. Right after that movie, I dropped my friend off at his house. He had the book Black Hawk Down. I borrowed the book from him, devoured that book, and started reading book after book after book on military and life in combat. And that was it. That was because what drew me in then was, but you also see or condone war, obviously, but there is an aspect to war that is very paradoxically peaceful. Having now experienced it, that's paradoxically it's pure, it's very addictive in nature. And at the time I didn't know all the things. I was a naive young kid, just having read about it, having looked at it, having read these stories of so many other stories since then of men sacrificing their lives for another, separate from all the politics of all the wars and all that. Just sidestep that for a second. And I wanted to live in a world where the good of the group mattered more than my individual well-being. I wanted to experience that. I also wanted to challenge myself. I was living a selfish, worthless existence at the time, right? Doing a ton of drugs and all of that. So most importantly, it was the aspect of service. Because once I joined the Marines, in the Marines, nobody cares about your well-being. What matters is the men and the mission. And that's it. It's at moments it really sucks when you're really tired and you don't want to go out on mission or whatever. But it's profoundly beautiful to experience life in an institution in a world like that. And so sorry, go ahead.
Would you say that one of the reasons that resonated so well with you is because it gave you a purpose at a point in your life where you felt purposeless?
Absolutely. It gave me something to now strive towards. Even joining the Marines was quite a challenge because I have a blood disorder that 2 doctors told me would kill me in boot camp. I have about 25% less oxygen moving through my body than it's normal. It's a blood disorder called thalassemia. I'm also flat-footed and I have scoliosis. So all of these are disqualifying conditions to join the Marines. But this was a post-9/11 military. So here's a young kid who wants to go infantry. They found a way, but it took about a year and a half of going to multiple times, like to the MEPS, the military entrance processing station, and fighting my way to get in. But that was what I knew I had to do, and I did what I fought my way in, essentially, to just go into the Marines. But it changed my life, and everything I am today, it birthed in the Marines.
And you joined when you were 18?
I tried to go in when I was 18, but because it took a year and a half, I didn't end up actually going in till 19.
Okay. So you eventually got through that process because of the blood disorder and some of the other things that you just mentioned, because you felt attached to this purpose. And to me, it's so incredible that a movie like that, and they did such a good job with that movie depicting the reality of war there.
Mm-hmm.
But to your point as well, really selflessness and not even thinking about the fact that you're going to die, but just as you described, protecting the men and serving the mission.
Mm-hmm.
When you went to war in Iraq, talk to us about, you were there for 7 months, correct?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And what time frame is this? What year was that?
I was there in 2007, 2007. Came back in 2008.
Was it, you talk about the pureness of war. And I think a lot of people perhaps maybe listening don't quite understand what you... Yeah, because number one, they haven't experienced it, or I would say that you can only understand that when you've experienced some real fear or trauma in your life. And to me, when I hear you say that, it resonates a lot because, being an entrepreneur, you go through a lot of very traumatizing things, just living life, quite frankly. You talk about war really peels away all the facades. As you described it, it's raw humanity in its best and its worst forms. Where we live in a society, and I want to talk all about this as we get further along, that is so fake. And one of the principles that you talk about, and I want to get into this because I'm interested to hear your perspective on this, is we talk about confidence, we talk about positivity, and you view those all as lies and destructive myths. And so I want to get into that and talk about your thoughts on that. But war kind of peels away all of that garbage, if you will, because it's war.
Yeah. Again, to your point, it's course.
Absolutely.
actually wrote a thesis on the war in Iraq. So I've studied it intensely. Should not have gone in there. There were a lot of lies, but on the ground, we were doing some good. We genuinely wanted to help the Iraqi people. They would work with us. They would tell us that, thank you for what you were doing, things like that. So on the ground, we're doing something meaningful. So now you have meaning, you have tribe, you have brotherhood. The volume of life is dialed up out there, right? Because it's intense. Over here, you're going through the mundane. Over there, that's rarely mundane because you're constantly in an intense environment, right? So the intensity of that is dialed, right? You're serving people, you're with each other. All of these factors, it makes it quite, and then coming back to the point of the intensity, the struggle, the fact that it is, when you're in this very, very intense environment, it removes those masks, the facade. There's no room for that fakeness, and it's just so real. So you see people, when you see, and not even in just war, but when you see suffering, like that's why now I'm drawn to it in a very different context through these endurance sports. It allows you to bring out the essence of the human spirit at its most pure, because when you're in pain is so all-consuming, right? It's so all-consuming that you don't really give a shit about putting on whatever mask we do in the mundane to go through life, to put on a show, to look a certain way for social media. None of that matters anymore, right? You're just in the realness and the humanness of that. And that is very profoundly beautiful to experience, which is why I continue to do the things that I do. But in war, you kind of get all of these things. And because of that, it's also very structured. So you don't have to really because of that structure, it provides a kind of freedom from the paradox of choice, from decision fatigue, from all these things. The normal, you're an entrepreneur, you get it, right? In the normal world, there's a million different decisions to make. It's overwhelming. Out there, it's structured. So it's simple. That simplicity, all of these factors make it strangely peaceful in a way to say. And then again, and I know that sounds a little crazy because again, I'm not condoning it, but that's one of the reasons why many people struggle when they come back. Is because you now come back from that environment and you're working some job somewhere, without all those elements now taken away from you. Inevitably, it's going to be hard to come back.
Yeah, and you describe it so well to help us understand, as you just said, it has all the basic needs of human survival,
Exactly.
without some of the pain points of should I do this, or the politics or the drama of being in work or being in a business,
Exactly.
just being in society. Talk to us about your worst experience overseas.
It was hard to say, sort of. It's been a minute too, and like one particularly worst experience. When I went also towards the end of the war, which is why one of the reasons I struggled, we didn't go through. We didn't it was towards the end. Like our unit was the last unit that had a battalion size element take over an area, which was then a company size element took over. So it was towards the end of the war, meaning that we didn't have a ton of firefights happening. Our biggest threat was the IEDs. We'd have pop shots go around at us all the times, throughout. But our biggest threat was the improvised explosive devices. And our unit did a really good job finding them before they could be used to kill me and my fellow Marines. So point is to say, is one of the reasons why I struggled after the war was I felt like I didn't, and again, admittedly, I was a young, naive kid, but I didn't experience the intensity of war in which I wanted it to. Because again, we had pop shots going off all the time and rounds and stuff like that. But at this point, also, just to step back, before going to Iraq, I had gotten big time in outdoor sports. And so my level of risk tolerance was quite high. I used to rock climb without rope. Nothing at nothing like the free solo level or anything like that. But
I was going to ask, so the free solo style
level, but high enough that if I fell, things would have gotten bad. So I got into skydiving, rock climbing, scuba diving, mountain climbing, every outdoor sport, and playing on those edges of experiencing fear. So when I went out there, what brought up a fear response in me, it took a lot more, not because I was braver, but because I had more references in my brain to say that, my risk tolerance was much higher. So I wanted to go in a way, and admittedly, this was a kind of seeking of a new edge in a very dark world. Again, I was a young, naive kid, right? So I didn't get to experience that, but I had a uniquely dangerous job out there. My job was to walk in front of our vehicle convoys, looking for our bombs before they could be used to kill me and my fellow Marines anytime there was a danger zone. So if our convoy was going across a bridge, me and one of the Marine would walk across the bridge first to sweep it, make sure there's no bombs. So obviously if somebody was to get killed first, it would be me and that other Marine, right?
Yeah.
So we learn to just thrive, and the biggest challenge in war like this is in counterinsurgency warfare, which was Iraq and Vietnam, things like that, is that you're in a normal city, and most people here just want to take care of their families, live a normal life, but you never know who is that one person that wants to kill you. And killed not just us, but killed the local civilians. Like the first week we were there, the insurgents cut the head off a local Iraqi and threw it on the streets, basically saying that if you work with the U.S. Marines, this is what will happen. It had a reverse effect. The locals would work with us because they were tired of that too. So
Yeah.
it was in that sense, it was a heightened stress environment all the time, because you're walking through streets, and 99% of us don't want to actually hurt an innocent human being, right? Like, we don't. Why would? Obviously not. These were innocent people just living a normal life like you and me, and they just happened to be born in a world that was a lot tougher than the world you and I were born into. So, but good people. And so you don't want to kill somebody innocent, but at that same time, if you make a wrong call, that one person could be the one who was trying, like, for example, women over there would wear the burqas and stuff, right? And so they knew that out of respect, we wouldn't physically search a woman. We would often do it to men sometimes, like just pat them down. But so what started happening was the insurgents would dress up like women and wear suicide vests. And so you never knew. And so whenever we see
Yeah.
women, we'd often look at their feet to see if they had manly looking feet, just because, again, you never know which is that person. So that keeps a fairly heightened state of stress all the time. And one of our many mantras was complacency kills, because you could have like 2 months with nothing happening, and then that one time you fall asleep or you get complacent, that's when things can go wrong. So just the nature of that in and of itself was fairly, constantly heightened stress out
Yeah, I
there.
mean, that's a great mantra. Complacency kills. I mean, I would argue that not necessarily in its purest form of killing, but in life, complacency kills.
I completely agree. Yeah.
When you find yourself complacent, we'll talk more about that. You describe an incident over there um, that, as you said, your job was to go and find these IEDs, improvised explosive devices, or sweep a bridge, and you went across one that was live, and for whatever reason it didn't go off,
Yeah.
but one of your combat buddies went across one that did go off and he died. Tell us about that and how you struggled with that when you came back and
Yeah.
what that resulted in.
Yeah. So I didn't actually know about this till many years later. My staff sergeant told me, staff sergeant was the squad leader, that our vehicle was drove over an active bomb that just for some reason didn't explode. I didn't actually know that till many years after the war, which was kind of wild to hit me. But as you said, one of my closest buddies in the war, he died before I went. So a little backstory about him. When we first joined the unit, we were the same kind of Marine. We bonded immensely, and we volunteered to go to war every chance we could get together. At this time, again, two young careers, we wanted to. We were joining Marine Corps infantry for a reason. So we were like, let's go, like let's just go do the thing, kind of thing. And twice the Marines told us we were going. Twice it got canceled. And one time I went, so because it wasn't happening, I went on the summer vacation, I went to India to visit one of my family. And that summer, he ended up finding a unit to go with, and he was deployed and volunteered to go, and he got hit with an IED and got killed. And when we were in the unit together, we would do everything together. Like we would compete together, friendly competition, like during the run. But I might beat him by like 3 seconds on the run, or by 2 points on the rifle range. And we'd always have that. And so when he got sent out there, he got promoted to corporal, which had him put in a seat that resulted in him being killed. And so for me, I really struggle with that, because in my mind, maybe if I had gone, because since I would beat him by a few points, not because I was a better man than him, but because I would beat him by a few points, I could have gotten that promotion and been in his seat, so he could have come back alive. And so I was at his funeral detail right before I got called up to go to Iraq. I was on that, the gun salute, lifting the casket, all of that stuff, and we were very, very close. Like he was my brother. And so when I went, I felt really guilty that I left for that vacation for India and I didn't stay. That was twice they told us we were going, didn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
One time they did end up going, I was not there. And so I felt like I betrayed that commitment. So when I came back from Iraq, I struggled with the fact that nothing happened to me. I didn't get shot. I didn't lose a limb. I didn't get killed. Why did he die? Why did so many others have suffered so much more than me? I did my job or anything, but I didn't really do anything noteworthy. And so I struggled. And so I wanted to go back to war every chance I could. I struggled with life in this normal world. I came back and also went to college. And, you know, at the time I didn't have the level of awareness I do now. So you can't judge a person who makes decisions based on their awareness, because we all have our awareness. But when you come back from war and you see college students complaining about things, it's hard to deal with.
I can only imagine, Akshay, you probably just wanted to punch them or just give them
Exactly.
a dose of the real world. And what are
Yeah,
you
and
guys whining about?
forget about saying it started. You know, so this is absolutely insane. And so I tried to go back, didn't get a chance to go. So then I actually went to go get a master's in journalism so I could go back to war as a combat journalist. I just wanted to return to a wartime environment, and I was doing everything I could to go back there.
And do you think that was based out of guilt, why you wanted to continue to go back there?
For sure, that was definitely a big part of it, because I felt like I hadn't suffered enough to earn my place on this planet, to earn my life. And the other part was, again, I didn't do this. I didn't have I didn't fully understand it now, but looking back on my life, I can understand it a little bit deeper. The other part of it was to kind of go back into that purity of that experience. That is strangely much more peaceful, and it's much more, maybe peaceful is not even the right word. It's much more real
Yeah.
than this world, than the normal world. And I wanted to go back to that.
Yeah. Society, I mean, society is very fake. And I think, it's interesting. That's a whole conversation. When I look at millennials and younger, these generations who have grown up on electronics and social media, where there's not a shred of authenticity or genuinity. How do you say that? Genuineness. So much of out there is fake. And I think we're seeing the impact on the hearts and the minds of the general population on what that really does to the human mind.
Mm-hmm. I couldn't agree with you more. Yeah, I mean, we're putting on a show to be a certain way. I see this all the time too. Even adventurers who put on a show for this whole thing, and it's just it's it's not helpful for the individual. It's not helpful for our collective consciousness. That's for sure. And like you said, we can see the impact. Where it's could not be more evident.
So you come back from Iraq and you're struggling with PTSD, and you get back, or you start into alcoholism. Is that correct?
So when I came back in college, like I still did really well both in undergrad and masters, and I would party in over the weekends like a college student, and didn't really see it as a problem back then. I mean, it's college weekends, everybody's kind of drinking or whatever, you know. So yeah, I would drink hard for sure, but I always did what I had to do in terms of getting good grades, still kind of training pretty hard. But so the I didn't get into the depths of that pit, of that abyss, till many years later. After coming out of college, like in my master's, I met my now ex-wife, but I met my wife at the time, and so that's why that plan changed to not go to not be a combat journalist, because that's not very conducive to a family lifestyle. I certainly wasn't looking to meet anybody, but it happened, and so then I had a corporate job for a year and a half, which I was miserable, and so then
What did you do?
It was like a sales and marketing job at this company called Volt.
Okay.
Fortune 1000, and just hated it. It was everything about it sucked. And I mean, the day I signed on for that job, I knew exactly when I would quit, because I also signed up for an expedition to do a 1-month ski crossing of Greenland, dragging a 190-pound sled for 350 miles across the ice cap in Greenland. And on that expedition, back then, again, I wasn't as aware as I am now, but I was just going back to find kind of peace in a very intense environment. So today I'm still doing those things, but I'm doing it with a very different level of consciousness. I'm not doing it to run away. I'm doing it to run toward. Back then, I just wanted to run away from my demons. So I went and skied across Greenland, successfully make that crossing. But after I came back, now I had no job. I had no intense environment to guide my structure. I was building my own business. So in a world without external structure imposed upon me, that's when my demons started to rise, and the drinking started to get worse and worse and worse. So, a Saturday night of drinking became a Friday and Saturday, then slowly a Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and then so on and so forth. And, drinking 1 pint would lead to 2 pints, to eventually downing 750 milliliter bottles of vodka every single day for 5 days straight, until I would be throwing up and then picking up a bottle right after I would throw up to keep drinking. And this rabbit hole into like an eventual pit there, that one morning after 5 days of binge drinking, I woke up and I was about to slip my own wrist because I couldn't take it anymore. And that was the moment that kind of began my climb out of the abyss.
What happened in that moment that started the climb? Because there are a lot of people who, I've talked to a lot of soldiers, whether it's in the Marines, Navy, Army, and when they come back from serving overseas, they have this same feeling or description that you've just spelled out for us. And perhaps to a large degree, it is because of the resent of always putting on a front that's not real, which is so different than, as you've described, being overseas and serving in war. PTSD obviously is a very common thing for a lot of returning veterans or soldiers coming home. What in that moment changed for you? And what advice would you give to someone who, whether it's because they were serving in war or they have PTSD for other reasons, or they're just trapped or really at the bottom, which it sounds like you were at that point, very close to taking your own life? What changed?
For me, the thing that finally changed, because I would go through these binge sessions and then I would stop because I'd like, all right, this is horrific, and then I'd maybe be sober for like a month, 6 weeks, whatever. Then something would trigger me, I'd go back into the pit, right? And what finally had me start to change that pattern was the fact that I even thought about taking my own life. Because I would do this, but I never actually got to a point where I wanted to like end my life. And so the fact that I still remember waking up after this session, looking out into the wind, seeing the sunrise come in, walking over to my kitchen and like looking at a knife, about to cut my wrist. So just the fact that I even thought about and genuinely considered taking my own life was quite jarring to me. That was like, holy shit, I can't believe that just like something is horrifically wrong that I'm there, that I considered doing this. And it was not a smooth climb out of the abyss. Like I broke my sobriety ish at times after that. It wasn't like suddenly that happened and everything was sunshine and rainbows. It wasn't. So for me, when that happened, after that happened, I was like, all right, something needs to change. I need to do something differently. So I started going into reading books on neuroscience, on psychology, on trauma, on spirituality, started to do the inner work to confront my own demons and reframing my relationship to my own suffering. What I mean by that is, so I was diagnosed with PTSD by a therapist, right? Because as an example, I was very hypervigilant of loud noises. I didn't like being in crowds. I struggled with survivor's guilt. I was told these were symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. As I started reading all these books, especially one really powerful one was called What Doesn't Kill Us? The New Science of Post-Traumatic Growth. And he talks about how that's not a quote unquote disorder. That's a very normal human response to war. I spent 7 months in a place where loud noises meant death. Inevitably, I was hypervigilant. It's not a disorder. It's a normal response. But when you frame it as a disorder, that creates a construct about who you believe yourself to be. Instead, I was like, all right, I have post-traumatic stress, but post-traumatic stress does not mean post-traumatic stress disorder. There are two different things. And when I create that space between post-traumatic stress and the identity of disorder, I can now choose to do something else in that space and turn my post-traumatic stress into post-traumatic growth and to do something value with this. So as an example, my survivor's guilt, right? Everybody told me not to feel guilty, the therapist, the friends, family, and it's coming from a place of love. I get it. Rationally, I get it. You can't control what happens in war. My vehicle drove over a bomb, it didn't explode. His didn't. Who could control that? That's luck of the draw, whatever you want to call it, right? It happened. There's no why as to why that happened. It happened. But emotionally, it didn't change the fact that I still felt guilty. And the guilt was not the problem. The guilt is an expression of love. The reason I felt guilt because I loved my brother, right? That's not a quote unquote bad thing because there are no bad emotions. So this was the whole reframe that led to Fearvana, is that there are no good emotions, there are no bad emotions. There's only emotions. And it's up to us to decide what we do with them. So even guilt could be of value. So what I did was, for a long time, I put a picture of my friend that I lost in the war up on my wall, and it said, "This should have been you. Earn this life." And that helped me. That helped me stop wasting my life drinking, right? Wasting that. I mean, what was I? I wasn't honoring his life by drinking myself to an eventual death, which I was certainly going down that road. I wasn't honoring his life. I wasn't honoring this life I've been gifted. So instead of wallowing in my own self-pity and misery, let me earn this life by doing something worthy with it. Let me take my pain and use it to help others navigating their pain, which is what led to Fearvana and the whole ethos that suffering is not inherently bad. that these emotions, that fear, stress, anxiety, anger, guilt, they're not bad or negative emotions. They're more challenging than emotions like happiness and joy and dealing with that, but they're not bad. They can be framed and turned into something beautiful. And that was kind of what I had to go was reframing my own suffering, finding the beauty in it, and not demonizing these experiences as inherently quote unquote bad. Because even in the world we live in today, we have a paradigm that says trauma equals disorder inherently. And then that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. There was a great researcher, Dr. Martin Seligman. He went to West Point and he asked the cadets there, this is the military academy, right? He asked the cadets there, how many of you have heard of post-traumatic stress disorder? Something like 95% of people raised their hand. And then how many of you have heard of post-traumatic growth? And it was like less than 5%. And the point he makes is we live in a paradigm that says trauma equals disorder. Even to this day, when people hear that I'm a veteran, and it comes from a place of love, so I get it and I appreciate it, but there's always this kind of, oh, poor you're probably all kinds of messed up in the head, right? There's this, you have something wrong because you're, as opposed to you went through this experience, how did it make you stronger? I mean, COVID is a great example of that. Every article was like, COVID is causing more mental health issues. COVID is causing PTSD, this, that, and the other thing. Nowhere do you see a paradigm. Nowhere do you see a view that said, we went through collective adversity. Here's how we are stronger. Here's how we came out better, right? Like war is an example. Yes, it's hard. Yes, it's adversity. Yes, it's quote unquote traumatic. Yes, it's this suffering. Yes, I came with post-traumatic stress. But why don't we have a paradigm that says that makes us stronger, that we grow from it, that we can be better from it, right? And when you set that paradigm, it changes how you relate to your own trauma. And that's why the core teaching of everything I do and the most important skill to master in life is to develop a positive relationship to suffering. To suffer, as I like to say, to suffer well. Because when you can smile in the face of suffering, it won't matter whether life punches you in the face or whether you're seeking a challenge, like building a business, writing a book, whatever. Any challenge, you're going to suffer on the path. But if you know how to suffer well, if you know how to smile when suffering comes your way, then you can find beauty in the entire spectrum of the human condition, whether it be the summits or the valleys.
Why do you think our society has set up this paradigm of self-pity, if you will?
I think it's, and not everybody's going to like this answer, but it's very alluring to be a victim. Because when I'm a victim, I can shed that responsibility. It's not my fault. It's the world's fault. The world did this to me. And so it's very easy to stay in victim mode. Even when I was going down this research of post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and all these things, addiction, like, for example, when people would talk about depression, and I would say the same thing, like, you can navigate it through this internal means. People would defend their limitations. You don't get it. Depression is not just sadness. It's very different. And look, I get it. I've been in the throes of it. But if you fight for your limitations, you get to keep them. And it's easier to hold on to them because now my world sucks. My reality sucks because the world is this way, or it's not on me. I have this disorder. The world did this. It's very alluring to be a victim because it sheds that responsibility. And I know a lot of people aren't going to like that. It sounds harsh. But here's the thing, when you seize ownership over your reality, it's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, if you don't like your reality, guess who it's on? It's on me. That's a hard pill to swallow. But on the beautiful side, it's also on me to change it. And I'm not saying, look, there's a lot of life we can't control. Coming back to the COVID example, whether you agree or not about the gyms shutting down, it was a reality, right? Like when that happened, for example, I lived in Jersey, a lot of the gyms were shut down. And everybody was like, oh, I can't work out now. There's no gyms. I'm putting on weight. It's not on me. So to inspire people, I ran 50 miles around a cul-de-sac, like a 0.05 mile, 1,000 loops around a tiny cul-de-sac right outside my house. There's always a way, I couldn't control the fact that my gym was shut down, that the parks were shut down that I usually played in and went running in, but I could control something. So we can always control our actions or attitudes. So I think part of it is that it's very alluring. And then inevitably the people in power want people to be a victim because now I can have power over you. If you seize ownership and I have inner authority, inner power, the other person in power doesn't have power over me. I can seize my ownership over my own reality. But it's a hard thing to get out of. And then there definitely will be people who are triggered by this. I've done posts about some of the things I'm saying, and you can see it. It triggers the shit out of people. But if somebody listening is triggered, I invite you to be curious. Take a look. The trigger is the gift, as my wife likes to say. The trigger is the gift. There's something there if you get triggered by something, anything, whether it be something I say or something else. There's a reason that triggers you. Take a look. But it is hard to seize ownership over your reality. I mean, hell, I was in victim mode. I was wallowing in my self-pity for a little while until I said, look, suck it up. Like, this thing happened. It's a lot, people have it a lot worse than me. And it's not to deny my own pain, to feel the isness of my pain, to experience my pain. But now, what can I do to be of value? What can I do? How can I turn this into something good? One of my favorite books, Why Bad Things Happen to Good People by Harold Kushner, he said in there a line that touched my soul in terms of dealing with the people we lost in life is the dead depend on us for their redemption and their immortality. The dead depend on us for their redemption and their immortality. And so I could choose to waste my life, dishonor my friends by being, for lack of a better word, or I could choose to honor his life, to honor the ones that have lost, many others that have lost along the path, and be worthy.
I think you've hit on so many great points there, as particularly as it relates to this paradigm that we've set up in society. That misery does love company. We've all heard that saying, but that power aspect is something that I think is so important in the constructs of society, whether you're talking about within an organization, whether you're talking about within relationships, or whether you're talking about politics. It doesn't really matter whether you're talking about between foreign nations.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's this lack of understanding that when you embrace the victim mentality, you are resigning your power and giving it to someone else.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's inherently what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And you just described that perfectly. And it's almost scary to me that it seems like, and one could argue, and again, as you pointed out, people don't like to hear this, particularly those in power, whatever that may be, this idea of picking yourself up by your bootstraps, getting out of the victim mentality, and sucking it up and controlling your destiny.
Mm-hmm.
But the interesting thing is there's so much more enjoyment and happiness out of this concept you've described of Fearvana, embracing it. And really, the happiest moments aren't happy if you don't have the juxtaposition of the challenges that it takes to experience those. I was just having this conversation with one of my business partners on, if life is great and you have no struggles, that becomes your baseline.
Yeah.
Well, you know how much harder it is to experience happiness or joy if your baseline is perfection and you have no troubles? It doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
And so you go down this path of, I think we see it with a lot of people who, a lot of the wealthy, people are like, well, if I had money, I'd wealthy.
Yeah.
Look in society. Some of the wealthiest people commit suicide at rates that seem way out of proportion compared to normal society. And why is that? It goes to this concept of exactly what you have been espousing for these so many years about Fearvana. If you try to shy away from adversity, from suffering, from challenges, how are you going to enjoy happiness, the time with your family, the things in life that really matter in those moments? You can't really.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, no, go ahead with what you're going to say, and then I'm going to ask a follow-up on that.
Oh, no, jump in with your question. It sounds like there was a question. Yeah.
What do you think it's going to change in society do you think that paradigm in society can ever change realistically on a whole level?
I think it's very hard to change it on a collective level. I think you'll see pockets of it for sure, but I mean, the inherent nature of pain is that it's painful. So to embrace it, to fall in love with it, it's inherently challenging, because the nature of pain is that it sucks. It's painful. It's much easier to thrive in pleasure, obviously, because you're in pleasure. That's the very nature of it, right? There's a great Latin phrase that says amor fati, love fate. It's easy to be grateful and to love fate when life is good. Can you do it when you're being punched in the face? And that's why the very nature of it is hard. I've seen this in very extreme circumstances. I've worked with survivors of sex trafficking, with former child soldiers, people in poverty, in leper colonies. And when I remember I was in Liberia, in West Africa, and here are these people who just come out of brutal civil war, Ebola, poverty, met a guy who was a former child soldier. They've experienced absolute hell on earth. Now, when you've gone through that hell, to then say seek out struggle in some way as a way to find peace, how does that even make sense? Inevitably, I've gone through the worst hell on earth. I want to do everything to avoid pain because I want to be in a state of pleasure. And you can see this happening in real time when you're in these places that have gone through some of the greatest pain people can experience. that they're now seeking just like what they think the West's ideal is, right? They'll go on social media, the woman there will be doing like the Kim Kardashian poses and all that, and you can see it like not creating a fulfilling life, because this is not an ideal we should be striving for, and is kind of the conventional view when the outside world sees of what the U.S. has. U.S. call what you want, I don't care, you can admit it, you can reject it or admit it, but U.S. is still viewed as the kind of the mecca of what the world, like our influence in the world is the greatest, right? And not always for the better, for sure. But so this world we're seeing, you can see that out there, and it's not creating fulfillment. But how do you even navigate that for somebody who's seen so much hell to say, yeah, actually the path to really finding more peace is actually to now go into struggle? Like, wow, of course not, right? And so that's why it's a hard thing to wrap your head around. And I recognize, like, even me, I'm privileged that I get to choose my own suffering. I'm not unaware of that. I've seen people in these hell on earth who don't get to choose their own suffering. Most of the world doesn't get to, because they're forced into hell, right? And I get to, and I'm not unaware of how privileged I am for that. I feel tremendously grateful, and one of the many reasons why I give back to try to help people be at least to have the freedom to then choose their own suffering. But here's the thing. Whether you seek it or not, life is going to punch you in the face. Whether you seek it or not. You could have $0 and be in hell on earth in Liberia. You could have $1 billion and living in the US in the lap of luxury. You're going to suffer. As you said, we've seen rich people, they commit suicide. So you're going to suffer. So if, as I like to say in Fearvana, if you don't seek out a worthy struggle, struggle will find you anyway. You get to choose which suffering you want. But if you seek out one, this is the one that is worthy of who you are, who you want to be, one in service of your own evolution. And it's your worthy struggle. It doesn't have to be mine. It's not about skiing across Antarctica. That's certainly not the only path to enlightenment and peace. It doesn't have to be building a business. It can be writing a book, playing the guitar, playing basketball, whatever it may be. But any path will be struggle. And when you seek out that worthy struggle, that is the one worthy of who you are and who you want to be, and you fight for it, you commit your soul to it with obsessive fire within your spirit, then, and you learn on that path to falling in love with suffering, because that's like the core teaching of Fearvana, is helping people fall in love with suffering so they can find, live, and love their worthy struggle. That's what I call your path in life, your worthy struggle. That's the throes of it. And that's what it takes to, even research on happiness has shown that there's two things that make us truly happy and fulfilled. And I don't mean sort of that temporal happiness like I'm smiling. I mean using the word fulfillment. It's one, connection. So your tribe, who's your family, the people you love. And two is your meaning, your path in life. You have those two things, and you pursue it with consciousness, with awareness, with intention, and you'll have to fall in love with struggle, because you're going to struggle anyway. That's that's the very thing that we seek to, it's the very thing that we all want.
Do you believe in God?
I have my own version of what I believe God to be. I personally don't believe in a higher power, like an entity that is higher. My version of what I believe God to be is humanity at its finest. It's the part of us that feels compassion when we see pain. It's the part of us that allows us to transcend the limitations of our mere mortal self to do something impossible. Like, the example I always go to and always that lives within my soul is, have you seen the movie Hacksaw Ridge?
No.
It's a true story about this guy, Desmond Doss, in World War II. Again, Medal of Honor recipients. And I know I constantly go to those examples, but you can see normal examples like this in the day-to-day life all the time, right? A single mom working 3 jobs is impossible, but she does it to take care of her kids, right? To me, that's an expression of God. What Desmond Doss did, he pulled 75 people off a cliff, sometimes dragging them as far as a football field in the midst of a war zone, lowering them off this cliff. What he did was impossible. A young, skinny guy, but he did it. And that to me is an expression of God. It's the transcendence of ourself for something bigger, for someone else. So it's a very, the closest one could ascribe it to is a kind of Buddhist philosophy, that we have our own inner Buddhahood, our own inner divinity within us. And that to me is God shining through us. My version, not to say it's right or wrong. That's just what I believe.
You've traveled the world. You've been to the Himalayas, Kilimanjaro, Liberia, some of the most remote, desolate places in Antarctica, and you're currently in Alaska training for your 1,700-mile across Antarctica. When you see all of the beauty of creation in nature, and you get the chance to be in isolation, doesn't that, I'm a big believer in God, and I believe every man knows that there's a God, and part of the reason our society is in the struggles that we're in is because our continued intentional destruction of the idea that there's a higher power or that there is someone we're answerable to is ultimately what is leading to society's, you know, I'd say depraved nature, but just unhappiness.
I would agree. Yeah.
Don't you don't you see when all of the things you've experienced, and to reiterate a point you made before, uh, you're very blessed, I'm very blessed. Pretty much anybody in the United States, we're all incredibly blessed. And there are people in this world who we just don't even have a clue the type of pain and suffering they're going through. And this relates back to likely what you experienced when you came back from war and you're on a college campus and you have all of these young, dumb kids. And we've all been there. I was certainly a naive idiot in college,
Yeah.
complaining about the most meaningless, insignificant things. So I just wanted to make that point of just how blessed we are. But I believe that everything that we've been given is from God, and it's only by embracing the fact that that God exists, that we can find real purpose and happiness. If you, you know, again, I'm not a big, people talk about, I just want to be happy. And I hate that phrase. And we could talk on that for
Yeah.
2 or 3 hours. But what is your perspective there, given everything that you've seen?
Yeah. I do think, like going in these places in nature, there's a magnificence to the human experience that, like, to the world, to this incredible land that we've gifted with, and you see it and you taste it and you touch it. And I think that to me is an experience of God in a kind of like I also ascribe God as a oneness of all that is. It's like that. It's like enlightenment. You feel oneness in nature. You feel something deeply spiritual, deeper than the mere mortal coil that we're in. So I think the quote, like, there's actually a book called "Who Needs God" by Harold Kushner too, and I do think that the death of spirituality or the destruction of it is creating a lot of the malaise in our society. I completely agree with you there. And I like, again, I certainly don't have all the answers. I don't know all. There's answers to questions that are way bigger than me about what made us here, what brought us, what made the world the way it is. And I think through my own evolution, I have learned that, like, if you read Fearvana, for example, everything in there is researched. I've read hundreds of books. Every point is explained with research. I was at a point in my own life where I had to explain everything, even if not to anybody else, but I had to know the answers to the why for myself. After doing more of the things like the 10 days in darkness, the 7 days in darkness, and some of these more magical experiences that I've been through, I got to the point of embracing both the practical and the mystical in the human experience, right? And the mystical is that I don't have all the answers to why X things happens the way they do, but there is something in the human condition that goes beyond my understanding, and I'm finding the beauty in embracing the not knowing of this and just surrendering to the mysticism of the human experience.
Faith.
And that
What you just described is faith.
faith, exactly.
I'm a big believer that what you just described is faith, and there are certain things that the puniness of our human mind can't possibly comprehend.
We can't wrap our head around. Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But I think for me, the most spiritual teaching in my own life is embracing kind of the two dualities that exist throughout the human experience. Like, there's a series of dualities, right? I just mentioned, for example, practical and mystical, right? Two seemingly contradictory forces, but you can look at it like masculine, feminine, pain, pleasure, light and dark, ego, humility, contentment, discontentment, stress, recovery, fear, nirvana. There's a series of these dualities. And we live in a world that demonizes one side as bad. The fear is bad. The stress is bad. The demons are bad. The darkness is bad. None of them is bad or good. They just are. And when I said oneness earlier, I used that word. It's you start to see how these two seemingly contradictory forces can actually coexist and must coexist if you truly want to find inner peace and spiritual peace and move through life with greater peace in this human condition. So coming back to the duality of the practical and the mystical, I started to see how they both can exist. Science and spirituality do not have to be enemies. They can both coexist, right? I value the practical. I value the science. I also value the mystical and the mysticism and the spiritual. And through my own learnings, like especially going into the darkness, I mean, in the darkness, I had what I perceived to be a conversation with God, like hearing a voice that left me bawling in tears when I was sitting in a dark room. So I've had experiences that have touched me to something that I don't even know what you want to call that God, and I don't even know if I know fully how to explain it, but I know what I experienced, and I think that's that ability to find oneness in all of life's dualities is how you truly attain and call it enlightenment, spiritual peace, an awakening, whatever word you want to ascribe to that. You find how we are more than just one side of that, and there is a kind of non-dualism that exists, that both sides can and must coexist to lead to the next spiritual awakening.
Talk to us about that 10 days in darkness. Where did you do that? And did you wake up one morning and say, you know what, I think I'm going to create suffering and, sit in the dark for 10,
Yeah.
24-hour days and see what happens?
So I've done this darkness retreat experience twice. The first time was 7 days, and second time was 10 days. So what first got me into it was, as I mentioned, I touched on earlier, my ex-wife. So I was married for 9 years, and without going too deep into that story, because it's not entirely mine to share, but she got caught up in a cult, and our marriage ended. It was a crazy situation the way it ended, and it was dark. It was hard. I broke my sobriety. I went deep into the pit again. And so I wanted to go deeper within to find some answers because I didn't like that version of myself. And I had done a lot of epic physical feats at this point. I even written Fearvana. So done a lot at this point, right? But
What year is this, plus or minus?
As far as that divorce, it was about 5 years ago now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So 4 or 5
So
years
pre-COVID
ago.
and
Pre-COVID, yes, for sure. And then I forget what year the 7-day darkness was. The 10-day darkness was not last year now, but 2021. Yep. But the 7-day darkness was a few years before that, because that was what drew me in, because I was going to go into those 10-day silent retreats. You might have heard of Vipassanas. Those are much more common, these silent retreats.
Okay.
And I stumbled into the concept of a darkness retreat, and I found it far more appealing than a silent retreat, because in darkness, you're shutting off one of the primary ways in which we engage with reality, our visual sense. So even in the smallest way, I have something external to latch onto with my eyes when I say that's a wall, right? My mind has someone external to go. In darkness, you have nowhere external to go. So you are forced to go within. So that was the draw the first time, was to go in to kind of see what I would find in that journey within, in the greatest hero's journey there is, and to find some answers, to find some healing. But the second time I went in, I was in a good place. So at a meta level, one could say the first time I went in was to heal the past. The second time I went in, which was a year and a half ago, it was to train for the future. It was training for Antarctica. It was 10 days of darkness and silence, 10 days of darkness and isolation as training for 110 days of solitude that I'll experience in Antarctica. But that was the draw. The first time I went into was in Germany, and the second time was in Mexico.
And what was the difference in your experience between those two? So you're sitting in a room. Describe what.
Yeah, it's a fairly small room. There's like a bed, a bathroom, a couch, kind of meditation couch, both places. Obviously, a little bit different vibe, but essentially just that. And it's 24/7 darkness. You cannot see your hand in front of you. It's pitch darkness. Because they also say that your brain releases DMT when you're in extended periods of darkness like that. And I experienced this viscerally. So you start seeing lights in the dark. The brightest white light I've ever seen in my entire life was during that first 7-day darkness retreat. I mean, it was so bright, it was blinding. I was literally shielding my eyes. I was covering my eyes. I was touching my eyelids because I couldn't tell if they were open or closed. And it was blindingly bright while sitting in a dark room.
What day did that happen? And did that happen in both experiences, or the first 7-day experience?
The blinding white light happened in the first one. In the second one, I didn't experience a light like that, but I had different kind of light, quote unquote, light shows in the darkness as well. Both times the lights were very real, just different versions, different experiences.
And what did you learn from, let's just take your second experience, your second 10-day experience. What manifested itself after doing that?
The two. So when I went in the second time, I was, as I said, training for Antarctica. So one of the things I did, I had gotten deep into studying method acting. You familiar?
No, what's that?
Method acting is actors who when they're preparing for a movie role, they live and breathe that character. So even when the cameras aren't filming, they stay in character. Greatest method actor of all time is Daniel Day-Lewis. He is so masterful at becoming that character that one director said of him, "I've never seen somebody come as close to complete obliteration of the self." So why I started studying this is because if Daniel Day-Lewis and other method actors like Robert De Niro, for example, or Heath Ledger was a master, and very sad what happened to him, but his role was masterful, right? Is that they have an ability to completely shed every construct of their own identity, of all the constructs that make Daniel Day-Lewis, and they have the ability to craft a completely new character. Now think about how that can apply into personal growth. If there's elements of me that aren't serving me, I can create whatever character I want to create. So I went obsessively into studying the craft of method acting, and I went into the darkness to create the character I need to be to ski across Antarctica. And when I was doing these meditations or pacing back and forth on a yoga mat in the darkness, I was surrendering to the character that I had started to create, because I'd already gone deep into this process. The darkness was kind of the final culmination of letting the character reveal itself through me. And I said phrases that I'd never said before, and I was building a new identity. The 10-day darkness is also where I had what I perceived to be a conversation with God that left me bawling in tears. And so it crystallized more elements of my constructs of myself, of my life. It helped me embed some into me to fuel me all because with the 10-day darkness and with the whole method acting process, the fundamental ethos of that is it's very future oriented. So you'll see many of us live in the past. We will live in the stories of the past, and then use it to either justify a limitation or use it to frame why our reality is XYZ. With method acting, the past doesn't matter. You don't matter. All that matters is the character you're creating. Now, why that's so valuable for us is, as in personal growth, is none of my matters. I don't need to wallow in the million reasons why this thought may be this way. Who gives a shit? All that matters is, who do I want to be? I'm going to create that character. And then from that very future-oriented lens of building the self, building an identity, I'm creating a new construct in the present to orient towards that future, right? And then you become that. So that's what the process was in the 10-day darkness, was a becoming, if you will, was a becoming of the Akshay 7.0, the next version of Akshay that I need to be to ski across Antarctica and to spend 110 days alone.
What would you say to someone who says, I hear what you're saying, but it sounds like in this idea of method acting, this person is just not happy with who they are currently, so they're trying to be someone else?
Great question. The desire to create someone else doesn't inherently imply that you're not happy with who you are. But if you're seeking growth, and yes, I do want to create someone else, but you can be content and discontent at the same time. This is coming back to the duality. I'm very content with my life. I could not love my life anymore, but there will always be some discontentment, but discontentment fuels desire, because I want to build into someone new. I don't want to be the same version of me that I am 2 years from now. Why would I want that? I want some new evolution. I want to be able to look back at my life. Like when I look back at my life now from this version of me, look back who I was in high school or college or even 5 years ago, I'm like, wow, I don't, like, geez, I can't believe I was that person. And 5 years from now, I want to look back on this version of me and say, wow, I can't believe I thought that certain thing or certain thing. So it doesn't inherently imply that you're not happy. You can be content and discontent at the same time. So the process of method acting, like the kind of the unique features of that, it allows you to actually go deeper into yourself, because I'll give you a very concrete example. Like when I started this process of studying method acting, I was at the time single. I'm now married. And, I had gone through this divorce a few years ago, and I would feel lonely from time to time. And I didn't want to admit that I was feeling lonely, because we all have these things about ourselves we don't want to admit because they don't align with the version of ourselves we seek to be, right?
Or what society thinks you should be.
Or should be, exactly. Let alone, especially for my goal. I mean, I'm training to be 4 months alone in Antarctica. I don't get lonely. Like I can't. No, of course I don't get lonely. But with method acting, when I started going down that process, I was able to be with that loneliness and confront it, because I stopped being attached to it as my own identity. Because I realized how malleable the constructs of our own identity is that I don't have to. Because what happens is when we feel that, then we start judging ourselves based on that, right? I feel this way. That's who I am. But with method acting, the fundamental principle is I feel this way, but that doesn't mean that's who I am. Who I am is the character I seek to create. So in fact, it actually allowed me to go deeper into my own stuff and be with it, confront it, sit with it, acknowledge it, talk about it without any, like, I wouldn't have this conversation with you a few months, a couple of years ago, because if it was there, I'd be too embarrassed to admit it. I'd judge myself for it, all of these things that we all have. But now I'm playing in that pit of all my own stuff, right? I'm swimming in it. I'm being with all of it because I don't attach an identity to it. And that's what's incredibly valuable, is I can be with my stuff without being attached to it, without identifying with it. And then I can use it to create who I want to be. Because in the process of creation a character, it doesn't mean you deny the isness of this self. It's actually being deeper with the isness of this self in service. And great method actors talk about this. Like, the value in that process is they're actually getting intimately connected with their own stuff as the actor, as the person, and bringing that stuff to the character that they're creating. In their case, like Daniel Day-Lewis, for example, he's creating a very different character that's far removed from his own self, right? Whether it be Bill the Butcher in Gangs of New York, or Lincoln in Lincoln, or, Hawkeye in Last of the Mohicans, all these amazing roles that he's played, they're very different and removed from Daniel Day-Lewis. In our case, if you're applying this to personal growth, and I believe, and I've studied personal growth for decades, there is no greater tool for personal growth than method acting. And I will defend that to the death. Like, that's a hill I'm willing to die on, because of how incredibly powerful it is to, one, look at your own stuff, and two, create who you want to be without wallowing in all that crap of the past and saying, like sometimes I feel like we get so deep into, why did this happen? What did this happen? Who do I create? Quote unquote, overcome your limiting beliefs. One of my many mantras is your limiting beliefs, because when you learn to disidentify from your own mind as real, your limiting beliefs don't matter. Who gives a shit that my belief is this way? I'm just going to do the thing that I want to do, and then I will build a new belief through that. Like, the belief is built on the battlefield. So I go to war with myself, and then I build a new belief. I don't have to overcome my limiting beliefs, because I don't give a shit what my mind is saying. I don't ascribe what my mind's voice is. I don't ascribe those thoughts, those feelings as real. What is quote unquote real is whatever I want to be real.
Do you believe there's right and wrong?
I believe there is, like, do you mean in a sort of meta level, moralistic? Like, I mean, I think there is right and wrong that exists in the world, and we can get into the nuances of how objective that is.
Well, and the reason I ask that is because there are, there are people, and they will take what you're saying out of context. One of the things that frustrates me the most about society is we are trying to do away with right and wrong. There is good, there is bad. There are things that are right, and there are things that are wrong. Okay, going up to someone and slapping them for no reason is wrong. But society, and this is not what you were just describing, because it put it in the context in which you framed it, but there are people who say, well, my reality is whatever I want it to be, and I've heard that used by people to justify actions that are not justifiable. And so how do you delineate that in the context of which you're talking? And I would also say, one of the things I've heard, and I don't remember what actor, I don't know if an actor specifically said this, or if it's perhaps a construct that I've heard, whether it's true or not, then this is why I'm bringing it up. Actors get so good at method acting and being someone different, because that's their career, that they are at risk of losing themselves and who they actually are. Don't you believe that there's that risk in constantly trying to method act and grow? Because at the core, there is someone who, this is who I am, and I'm satisfied with who I am, and I don't want to try to be anybody else. And I ask that because there are so many people out there trying to be something they're not, or trying to pretend to be something because of some construct or something else. And again, I'm not talking outside the bounds of morality, that I've heard what you've described in scenarios that are less than palatable, if you will.
Yeah, no, awesome question. So I'm hearing kind of two parts to that question in a way, and let me address the second part first. So as far as the sense of, like, I'm losing who I am, it's not so much about losing who you are. It's actually about ingraining the essence of who you are with who you also want to be. Because, I mean, you're here. Somebody listening to this podcast wants to grow. Why else they listen to it? Maybe some behavior isn't serving them. And the degree of the changes you want to make from this version of yourself to the next version of yourself is going to vary from every person. So when I was on the throes of drinking a bottle of vodka a day to who I am today, vastly different, right? Vastly different. But this version of Akshay versus the next one are probably going to be minuscule because I'm at a very high level of inner and outer mastery. So it's going to be smaller changes. So the point is not to lose this version of yourself. It's to actually ingrain this version of yourself with the next version of yourself. And through in this constant evolution. Now with actors in that role, they are actually going through, and Daniel Day-Lewis does talk about this, he goes through quite a depression after every role because he's embedded that into the very essence of his identity, that he's now killed off an identity he's built. So there's kind of a low that hits. But as he also talks about, and why this is why he also kind of retired eventually, and why he didn't do as many movies as a normal actor, because he was so deep into the role. But it also each role also helped him ingrain it into a new version of himself. So I think there's value in constant evolution. That's what part of makes life worth living, is the striving. It's not the summit. It's the striving for the summit, whatever that summit may be. That's the value, right? So it's about taking each evolution. Like, I don't have any regrets about the dumb I did in the past. There's a lot of things that I did that this version of me would look back and be like, I can't believe I did that. But it's all led to this version of me, right? All the things that I've made, the mistakes I've made, the hardships I've experienced. So I don't deny them. I actually use them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and what you just described, you put good words. The words I couldn't figure out based on what Daniel said is, I've heard actors, and that's maybe a little bit different because they're actually trying to be someone they're not to play that role. Yeah, exactly. And then cutting that off and trying to go back to yourself. You described what I couldn't quite put my mind around what I've heard, and that depression state, which is very different than what you're describing, going to Antarctica and kind of diving deeper and ingraining who you are, having that personal growth concept.
And even then, like when I come back from Antarctica, there's a low that follows these experiences, because when you're out there on these edges, the volume of life is dialed. It's dialed as high as it can possibly be dialed. So there's a kind of low that hits, and there'll be certain things that will have to change in how I move through normal life. Right now, I'm orienting my life towards training for that. So there'll be some changes, of course, and you adapt, but I'll take all the versions of me and adapt to a new version, right? So that's another value. And this kind of leads to the what I heard was the first part of that question you asked, is that, when some people hear this, to your point, it can kind of create a nihilism, if you will, that, oh yeah, everything is about my reality, and my past is an illusion. Everything about my constructs are not inherently true. Then I'm going to do whatever I want. And one could sure take it that way, but I think if you do, you're missing the point, because this is coming back to the duality of reality being an illusion and reality being certain. Like me and my friend actually had a really deep conversation about this, and we were talking about how, let's say I'm a father with some kids, and I hear something like this, I could be like, oh, if my entire sense of reality is a construct and an illusion that I can mold an identity and create whoever I want, then who gives a shit? I'm not going to take care of my kids anymore. I mean, sure, you could go do that, right? But the point is not to shed responsibilities of the practical reality. The point is actually to acknowledge they are there and to serve that, to then create a higher version of you for all of that. Now, look, everybody's going to take it the way you want to take it. But I think if we look at the malaise in society, we are seeing it's the shedding of responsibility of living for something greater, for someone else, that's so there's a lot of issues with collectively how we're living that are creating more mental health struggles, more issues than ever. And I think a big part of that is an highly individualistic, selfish reality. But so it's not about shedding responsibility for being good for others, for starting off with your core tribe and then, expanding to humanity to whatever degree you want to expand. It's more about then taking that, like recognizing the illusory nature of reality. And what I even mean by that, to kind of go deeper into that, like when I look at, for example, that wall in front of me, it's a blue wall. Now, why do I know that's a blue wall? Because when I was young, I was taught that thing that I'm seeing is a wall and that color I'm seeing is blue. So there's a construct embedded into me that at a simplistic example, that it's a blue wall. But that's how we engage with all of reality. Everything we move through is a construct that's been ingrained to us from education, from our parents, from the world, from the media we follow, this, that, and the other thing. It's creating the constructs about how we engage with everything in the smallest sense, from the things we see to the beliefs that we have. When you start to see the reality that we engage in as a construct and not reality as it is, you can start freeing yourself from certain constructs that aren't serving you. But the point of that, and coming back to what I said about this nihilism that could breed a fit is not to free yourself from all constructs. It's to actually create constructs that serve you, because constructs have value. There is a value in me seeing that that's a blue wall so I can engage with reality and have a way to define it. But there is a pure experience between the constructs that create our reality and our experience of it moving through that pure experience beyond all constructs. In the movie The Matrix, for example, when he finally sees the reality as the code and he's seeing beyond constructs, right? Now that's obviously a movie, but that's a deep, spiritual movie, as you may know. But that's the whole truth: is there is no spoon, right? Like as he says in the movie. But even in order to bend the spoon, the recognition there is no spoon isn't in of itself a construct. So the point of recognizing we have constructs is to then create constructs that serve you, with the recognition that the practical and the mystical, the responsibilities of life and the illusory nature of life can coexist as one. And I think that's the true spiritual awakening, to see how they both coexist. It's not one or the other, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I'm glad you made that clarifying point, which is why I brought it up, because a lot of people try to reconstruct constructs that need to stay in place and are simply fact. Okay, you can pretend that blue wall isn't in front of you, but if you go running at it 100 miles an hour, well, it's there and you're going to get injured. So
it's like if I
don't be ridiculous.
Over a fire, my hand's going to burn, And
exactly.
Buddhism, but a lot of Buddhist stuff, they talk about that. Like, it's not to deny the reality. If I jump off a building, I'm going to fall and die.
Right. And the reason I bring that up is because we're hearing a lot of this ridiculousness in society of trying to free man from right and wrong by saying no constructs matter and my construct is what I want my construct to be. And you clearly made that point. That's complete bogus. What you're talking about is using constructs that are truly just made up in your mind. I can't do this, or this is a limiting factor, and getting rid of that. And so I wanted to clarify that.
Thank you. It's a great question. Many friends have had great talks about this. So I love that you brought it up.
We're going to pause our conversation with Akshay right there. I'm so thankful and appreciative for him being so vulnerable and sharing with us his story of being in the war and PTSD, but really conquering PTSD and not looking at it as a disorder, but rather a moment in time, and utilizing that post-traumatic stress as motivation. And this concept that he's come up with of Fearvana, which is a combination of fear and nirvana, and really using what you're afraid of as motivation, as power. And you can tell that throughout so many of the different crazy outside journeys he's been on, he's gotten to really think to himself and touch some of those dark places in the mind, but also some of the really powerful areas when you just sit there in the stillness and give yourself the opportunity to think and explore everything that God gives us in creation. We're going to continue our conversation with Akshay next week in part 2. We're going to talk more about his expedition in Antarctica. We briefly touched on it today, but we're going to go into more detail, what he's trying to accomplish that no other human has tried to accomplish, why he's trying to do it, why there's purpose in it for him, and what he's hoping or thinking or expecting to get out of it. And then we'll also talk about his advice on if you're someone that's trapped in the day-to-day monotony and you feel purposeless, or you're not really sure how to take the next step of where you want to take your life. He gives us a real concrete idea of what you can do and talks about fear, stillness, and social connections. So be sure and join us next week for more on the Antarctica expedition and his advice on how to go from where you are today to ultimately where you want to go in your next step of personal growth. That's all the time that we have for this week's episode of the Andrew Holland Podcast. Thank you so much for listening or watching every single week. Please subscribe to the YouTube channel, the Andrew Holland Podcast, so you get the updates every week when we post the video version. Or if you prefer to listen to your podcast, please subscribe to the Andrew Holland Podcast on your favorite audio platforms, Apple, Spotify, wherever you listen to your other podcasts. Of course, I always like the interaction with you as my listener on Twitter. My handle is Holland Podcast. Reach out to me if you want to further discuss any of the topics that Akshay and I did, if you have insights, or if there's certain guests you want us to try to get. Follow me on Twitter. I love the conversation back and forth. Holland Podcast. Thank you so much for joining us this week. Have a great rest of your week, And we'll talk again next Wednesday with part 2 of our conversation with Akshay Nanavati. Thank you for listening to the Andrew Holland Podcast. Be sure to visit our website, theandrewhollandpodcast.com, for additional content on business, entrepreneurship, and everything in between. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Andrew Holland Podcast, to get notifications when new podcasts have been released. And lastly, follow us on Twitter, A Holland Podcast. That's A Holland Podcast for all the conversations we're having outside the podcast. Thanks again so much for joining us this week. Have a great day, and we'll talk again next week.